beautiful day in semi-lockdown. I hope you are staying safe wherever in the world you are, whatever country you're in. I'm sure everyone's going through something crazy right now. But the last couple of weeks were a little nuts. If you didn't catch, there was no episode last week. Basically, a little over a week ago, I was here in Thailand. I'm back in Koh Phangan. Very happy to be here of all the places one could be, but a little over a week ago, my girlfriend and I decided to end our relationship. We happened to be in different countries at the time, and the virus hadn't gotten that crazy. This was only a couple weeks ago. It was big in Italy, obviously China, a couple other places, but different parts of the world. We also had 6 months of travel planned. So basically we were like, we still love each other, we still care about each other, we still want to do this. Let's at least meet in person and do Africa and then part amicably. But then while she was on the way, she was in New York on the way to the airport, and it was like 6 a.m. in Thailand. My friend kicks down my bedroom door and says, "Britain needs to talk to you." And apparently that hour, it broke out in Egypt where we were going to go. So the place we were going to stay was closed down. And they went from I think 3 isolated incidents to 40 or 80 in one place in Luxor, one of the places we were going to go. So we had to last minute reroute to South Africa. We get to South Africa. This was about a week ago. Everything seemed super peaceful. I just flew 20 something hours to get there. Within 3 or 4 days, it blew up over there. And as much as we love South Africa, it is not the safest place to be in general. So we decided to, even though I just got there, we flew all the way back here, just made it in before they closed the border. So I'm very lucky to be on a beach island in Thailand. I hope you are safe wherever you are. Here we are. It's not quite lockdown here yet, but we're preparing for it. We basically have a month of food and all that stuff. So hope you're also adequately prepared. I don't love being cooped up either. I really don't love that everyone is on their screens more right now, because that's kind of the thing that most people do, especially if you're in a small apartment. What else is there to do? And I'm trying to find silver linings here, because I think it's obviously not great to be on a screen all the time. I'm looking at this as like a cocoon phase, which I think is a good thing to do for your brain periodically anyway. You're at home, it's a great time to read the books you wanted to read, do the yoga program you wanted to do. Can't socialize, but you can do a lot of stuff to stimulate your brain. And I've actually been reading quite a bit these last couple of weeks. So this Facebook Live, this podcast, is going to be a little more complex. I usually don't have notes written this tiny. On that note, just my last announcements. Is a great time. Got to plug it. This is a great time to do the archetype class or any sort of program you've wanted to do and didn't have time for. Now you have time to do it. If you're at home, you can't work, you can't go to school, can't do a lot of things, can't socialize. It's a great time to educate yourself. And I'm looking at it as my own cocoon phase. I just ordered a kettlebell. I'm reading all the heavy Jungian psych books that I don't always get to or don't always make time for. I've been basically reading 3 hours a day, because what else is there to do? There's Instagram, but there's better things to do than scroll Instagram. The archetype class is still available. It's at ruwando.com/archetype. You can also get a discount on my arousal control course. And I'm reinstating the free coaching session that I discontinued earlier in the year, because I want to be there for you. We're all home. We're all thinking. It's a great time to go into your cocoon and recreate yourself, and that's available there. And the Camino trip that I had planned earlier is probably... Well, it may or may not happen, but I'm not planning for it right now, because who knows if we'll be allowed out of the house come that time. All right, so today's topic is on the mother complex. 2 weeks ago, I did a kind of preliminary or introductory episode on it, and it's funny because I went deeper into Erich Neumann's book, The Origin and History of Consciousness. Erich Neumann was one of Freud's proteges. He was kind of Jung. He was the psychologist that Jung kind of handed over the lineage of depth psychology to. And reading his book, really fascinating ideas. And also, actually, randomly in South Africa, I came across another book that has been on my reading list for 10 years. It's Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. Oddly, I found out about Robert Anton Wilson back when I was just trying to get over social anxiety, and I downloaded a random torrent on hypnosis like audiobooks to like hypnotize yourself into being confident, and I had a bunch of his lectures, and he was talking about all this crazy stuff that I didn't really understand, like how the brain works and how we model reality and stuff. It kind of went over my head. But then when I was in South Africa last week, I borrowed that book from someone, and he actually talks about the same exact things in different language. Like, he doesn't refer to the mother complex. He does refer to the more biological aspect of certain parts of our psychic development, referring to the oro biosurvival circuit. And I'll define all this stuff as we go through. So this can be kind of a complex and abstract subject, or a very deep subject. So I'm going to talk about it on 3 layers. The first is the individual consciousness side. I mean, overcoming the mother complex is, in my opinion, and one of the first stages of the internal hero's journey for most men, women perhaps too, but I'm going to point to some ways that I think the hero's journey, the way the hero's journey is portrayed in modern media and the way most people talk about it is actually based on a male paradigm. I actually think it's kind of insulting to apply this paradigm to a woman's mind, because women have different experiences and different impulses. I'm going to flush that out. But it's a aspect of, like, I would call the sexualized hero's journey, in the sense that there's a different type of development that a masculine psyche goes through as opposed to a feminine psyche. And this mother complex thing, as I mentioned in the last episode, is something that I'm seeing is kind of like a plague, an epidemic amongst younger men, millennial men. If you're born after 1980, I think it's really common, unusually common, to have mother complexes, and this is independent of like how your mother raised you. I mean, certainly can be exacerbated if you have a domineering mother or a neurotic mother. But I actually think it's partly culturally induced. And the result of this is a lot of guys who have unusual anxiety. I think not only is it from culture, I mean, I think technology is a huge part of it. I'll get into that as well. But how it affects most men is that a lot of guys grow up and they might be physically a grown man. They might be in their 20s, 30s, whatever, but they have the psychology of a child, or they still have certain emotional patterns that are more adolescent than adults, as opposed to hundreds of years ago, most human males were men by the time they were 18, if not through puberty. It affects how you relate to women. It affects your relationship to your own feminine side, your own emotional unconscious. And a lot of things come from that: mental health, self-esteem, creativity. That's the first layer, the individual hero's journey of transformation, which applies to most of us, if not all of us. The second layer is Erich Neumann's thesis. So Erich Neumann's thesis of his whole book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, is that, and this is the idea that I thought was really new. It was new to me to think about it this way, that the evolution of consciousness in humanity, in humans, in Homo Sapiens, going from basically animal consciousness, just like our primate cousins, to the modern Homo Sapiens that can think and have an ego and can map out time and all that stuff. That maps directly to the individual consciousness. So, for instance, our Neolithic ancestors, our pre-Homo sapiens ancestors, basically had the consciousness level of an infant or a child or a toddler. A young child has the consciousness level of, I don't know, an early Homo sapiens. An adolescent has the consciousness level of our ancestors 10,000 years ago, and ideally a human today, or an adult today, has the consciousness of Homo sapiens. Like there's a direct correlation there. It's interesting because with the mother complex, someone who has a mother complex, in some ways, maybe not in every area of his life, but in some ways is getting trapped in that adolescent phase. And as I mentioned, that affects relationships. It affects all the feminine emotional sides of life: relationships, your creative side, your emotional well-being. So I thought it's really interesting. And with the sociological stuff, we're going to be referencing certain mythologies that I think are misinterpreted: the Oedipus mythology, Osiris, and Medusa. Because basically what we're talking about is the great mother archetype that exists in all of us to a certain degree. If you're a man, the mother archetype is something that greatly affects your expression, because in many psychological theories, your expression is greatly affected by your opposite sex parent, especially if you're heterosexual. We're going to get to that. And the third layer of all of this, to ground all this abstraction into like real stories, not to say that I've completely evolved past my mother complex, but I've certainly come a long way. If I look at my my relationships with women, my relationship to my own creative anima, my literal relationship with my mom. A lot of those things have changed drastically for the better, and I didn't actually work it out with my mother or necessarily with women, although to a degree. If you follow this show at all, if you know anything about me, I was in a matriarchal cult for a couple of years in my mid-20s, which relates to the sociological stuff we talk about. But actually, in that unusual environment, I got the opportunity to work out this mother complex with my cult mentor, who in many ways took the place of the maternal archetype, the great mother archetype, in both of its forms: the terrible, manipulative, dark feminine mother archetype, but also the good witch archetype. That, and I'll share some stories from my cult stuff. If you caught my 3-hour double episode of my time in the matriarchal cult, I basically ran through the broad strokes there. I didn't get to go into every single theme and every single side story, because then it would have been like a 20-hour podcast. So I'm going to share some of those stories from there. Let's see. Yeah, those are the broad strokes. Okay, so let's actually start with the third thing. Start with a story. So the way the mother complex showed up in me when I was 23, I had lots of anxiety. I was learning, I was trying to increase my confidence. So I would study things like typical psychology or dating psychology. I was exposed to the pickup community, all that stuff. But one feature of being in the mother complex is that all of my relationships with women, whether or not they ended positively or negatively, it didn't really matter what the result was. There was a sense of effort always, like connecting with, because I was so disconnected from the feminine, or I was so, in many ways, afraid of the feminine aspect of the psyche, both in myself and other people. It was very, like, every interaction I had with women had some level of contention, and I mean both on like the sexual level, but also even with like my own mother, with like female friends, and my own emotions, right? And if you've caught my other stories about things, you may know I had psychogenic sexual dysfunctions during this time of my life. I was very disconnected. I was like, I had terrible affect. I was one of those guys where would take a group picture, and then the photographer would be like, dude, why aren't you smiling? And I was like, in my head, I'm like, I'm totally smiling. What are you talking about? But really, I was so disconnected from my emotions, I didn't realize that I wasn't actually smiling. I mean, I was trying to smile, but I wasn't. Anyway, so when I entered the matriarchal cult, I was going from our typical patriarchal society, and I'm going to define what that is very specifically in a second, going from that convention into a world run by women. And I think, with my book that I'm writing on this time period, everyone wants to focus on the sex cult stuff or the manipulation stuff. I think the most interesting part of that experience was seeing an example of what the world would look like if it was run by women. Like all the norms were based on feminine principles rather than testosterone-driven principles. But in this setting, one of the first things that happened when I jumped into this world was that the woman who had become my cult mom, or fill in for my maternal archetype, looked me in the eye and she said, I'm going to slowly take away your independence. And I'm a 23-year-old kid who's perhaps arrogant because of his insecurities, and I just laughed her off or whatever. But that's literally what she did over the next year. She slowly took away my independence, and in many ways this hits on exactly the themes of today, of being sucked in by the mother archetype. And to just connect this to the Neumann thesis of how this maps to this whole mythological development. Basically, in many of the mythologies, in Greek mythology, Indian mythology, Egyptian mythology, you'll see this type of story where a hero or a proto-hero, someone who's not quite a hero yet, he's usually a young boy, often an orphan in the stories like Harry Potter or something, he comes faced with the or he becomes faced with what we call the great mother archetype, like the overarching maternal nature, power, feminine aspect of the psyche. And one of two things happen, not in the Harry Potter type myths, but in the ancient myths where things get really dark and gruesome. One of two things happen. He confronts the great mother, and she challenges him, and either he becomes castrated or blinded. Both of them are symbolic of taking away his masculinity. Or he rises up, and usually this is seen in the Medusa myth, where Perseus beheads Medusa, who Medusa is obviously a version of the Dark Mother. She's an old maternal figure who turns men to stone. He beheads her, and through the beheading, he connects with Athena, who is the good mother, and he becomes a hero, a hero in the sense that he becomes an individual man. So, bring this back to my experience. I went through different experiences, butting heads with these matriarchs in the cult, and in some forms, I definitely did get emotionally castrated or emotionally blinded, and got sucked into the dark feminine. And in other cases, I was able to rise up and create separation and reassimilate in a healthy way. So, like, a lot of this stuff comes in chapter 4 of my book. Just for context, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but in chapter 3 of my book is like the restoration phase, where I really became in touch with my feminine side in a good way. I for the first time in my life, I started recognizing emotions. I started looking at I started being receptive. I started to learn how to receive, whether it came to touch or whether it came to attention or anything like that. And then at a certain point, I started to notice diminishing returns on pleasure. And I think a lot of people experience that when they go from being too hard on themselves to being too soft on themselves. And this is chapter 3. In chapter 4 of my book, I started to notice that, like, it's not that fun to always receive and consume anymore, because I had healed whatever that part of myself needed. I mean, I had validated the feminine side of my psyche for the first time, perhaps. And I started to notice, like, there's like some itch in me that wanted to, like, rebel or fight or achieve serenity. And that's a very adolescent stage. Like, if you think of the typical teenage rebellion, it's usually something along those lines where, like, the kid, up until like maybe 11 years old or 10 years old or 12 or something like that, he's basically under the protection of his mother. Emotionally, he is. And around puberty, that's when, like, most people naturally have the urge, young boys have the urge to, like, separate and, like, do their own thing. And if they're faced with any sort of oppression, they want to rebel. The whole point of me speaking about all of this is that I think a lot of modern men are kind of stuck in that mental phase. So in chapter 4 of my book, that's when I start to notice the diminishing returns. And I started to notice for the first time the differences between a matriarchal and patriarchal structure. So I want to break those down, because this is actually very important, both for Neumann's thesis of how society maps to the individual, but also I just think it's interesting. So you may have heard me speak about, like, the origins of patriarchy in other episodes. I'll run through the biological side, and then I'll share what I came across that's new to me and what I've read recently. And first, must hydrate. Gotta stay hydrated. Okay. So a lot of armchair anthropologists like myself will look at, like, agriculture in human history as kind of our fall from grace. So in the Bible, in Genesis, one of the interpretations of Genesis, like, Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden, is that this is showing when man tried to control nature. Whether, the whole thing with the serpent and Eve being the one, I think that may have been twisted or rewritten later. That's my own, speculation. But it's basically showing how prior to agriculture, humans were just another part of nature. Humans were, the human population would ebb and flow based on the availability of food. Humans may have been conscious, but more conscious than other animals, but they basically, they were within the rhythm of nature, within the ecosystem. When man decided to control nature and develop farming and agriculture, now he was, like, reining it in. So in like archetypal symbology, this is represented by the Ouroboros, which you may have seen before. It's the symbol of the snake eating its tail. Is the idea that everything in nature and like our pre-human consciousness is all like it's all like one thing. Never ending. Like, the snake is eating its tail because it's like you're never. This is before the humanity has developed egos and separation from nature. And this is kind of like also the status quo in the hero's journey, where you're just part of the collective. Like, the hero doesn't really exist. Like, before Frodo leaves the Shire, he's just another hobbit. Before Luke Skywalker leaves Tatooine, he's just another Tatooine resident. Like, there's nothing special about him. He's part of the snake eating his tail. Him leaving, though, is where going back to the anthropological side, when humans, one more thing, during this time, masculine traits or testosterone-driven behaviors and feminine or oxytocin, serotonin-driven behaviors were likely in balance. In fact, many of these pre-agricultural societies seem to have been matriarchal in some sense. Like they certainly honored women and the maternal leadership more than modern society. And you know, basically not for moral reasons, but for practical reasons. Like there was a balance there. In times of scarcity, it's way more useful to be testosterone driven. When you have to fight nature, when you have to defeat a predator, when you have to hunt food, when you have to fight an invading tribe, that's important. But most of the time, and most of our pre-agricultural ancestors' experience, they were in like oxytocin chill out mode. They were in their parasympathetic mode. I mean, unless they were going through a famine or something, like they couldn't access food, most of the time they were chilling. I mean, if you look at a lot of the paleo suggestions when it comes to nutrition, or like Mark Sisson's Primal Blueprint, Mark Sisson, the nutritionist or exercise guy, a lot of the fitness and diet suggestions that people have in modern day basically glorifies pre-agricultural existence. People did not sit too long, they did not work too much, they lifted heavy things, they moved around, they socialized, they ate a variety of food. I don't remember exactly, but Mark Sisson has like 10 rules for being a Paleolithic person. Basically, a lot of us glorify pre-agricultural human existence and look at agriculture as kind of like this fall from grace. And I'm one of them. Like I look at like, I'm constantly talking about how like we're on screens all the time, we're sitting too much, myself included, but like I also like kind of like to romanticize pre-agricultural existence. Obviously there were terrible things back then, like you might get eaten any time. If you got an infection, you'd probably die. Like it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, but there are certain things that are more natural to our psyche that existed back then. However, the new idea to me was that Neumann suggested in not so many words that the development of agriculture, the attempt to control nature, and what we would call patriarchy, or a society that heavily favors testosterone-driven behavior, was kind of inevitable. The ego is seen as like the more masculine side of the psyche, and as humans developed an ego, developed consciousness for survival purposes, to try to recognize time and to be able to plan things and to think about what a buffalo might be experiencing, to plan on hunting them. It was inevitable that they would try to control nature, because the masculine or testosterone-driven impulses is trying to control the unknowns. If you think of like archetypes as like programs that have one function they want to repeat, the testosterone-driven programs are like, if there's any threat, we want to control it. If there's any unknowns or anything we don't control, we want to rein it in. So of course, they domesticated animals. They, being humans, domesticated animals, domesticated life, and built cities and all that stuff. And as that cycled out, generation by generation, testosterone-driven behavior became more of the instead of being a balance, it became more of the it became more hyperbolic in terms of like the better strategy, right? So as generations and generations went on, and agriculture incentivized people to hoard their wealth rather than share with their kinsmen, and cities grew really big and people became isolated, more and more became a better strategy to have testosterone-driven impulses, to be competitive, to be cutthroat, to be less empathetic, to save your food for your family, to build walls around your nuclear home, as opposed to the pre-agricultural, more matriarchal situations. That, in my opinion, and I think many people's opinion, is the origin of patriarchy. Was there misogyny in there too? Probably, but if anything, the misogyny was probably a result of these natural economic forces where, yes, if it's a male-driven world, it's going to be more challenging for someone who doesn't have a male brain, and it's easier to judge someone in those ways. And on top of that, bringing us back to the mythological side of things, one of the arguments that Jung and Neumann make is that the whole mother complex thing is basically a fear of the feminine of the male ego, or fear of the feminine of the human ego, let's say. And the feminine referring to oxytocin-driven impulses, but also the emotional unconscious, and women in general. So anybody who has like social anxiety around women has some version of a mother complex likely, or anyone who's afraid of their feelings is another example. All right, so back to the story of when I was in the matriarchal cult. I enter this world where women run the show, and not only do women run the show, more feminine values are the norm. So like it's very taboo in this society to be competitive or to do anything that would be typical bro behavior. Instead, the norms are deep emotional communication, being there for each other. Like Rick and Morty had in one of in the Gazorpazorp. If you watch Rick and Morty, there's an episode where they go to a planet run by women, basically called Gazorpazorp, where they basically domesticated men to breed only. And then they make a lot of jokes, obviously, but the common greeting there is, "I'm here if you need to talk." Like, that's the world run by women, right? It wasn't that extreme, obviously. It's a comic situation, but as I went through this very important restorative phase. And then I started to develop, it's kind of like I reverted back to toddler nature, where I was just like being receptive and being nurtured by this very feminine and nurturing environment. At a certain point, which is marked by chapter 4 of my book, I was like, all right, this is a little too much. And I started to notice that in this world, as one would kind of expect, men were kind of second-class citizens. Not in a terrible way, but in an interesting way, because there's only one modern-ish matriarchal society that has been noted. That's the Mogwo tribe in China, or Mogwo people in China. It was documented in Chris Ryan's Sex at Dawn. And basically what happens in this, I don't think they exist anymore, but they existed until the 1800s, I believe. In that society, women control everything. Property is passed down through women. Every household is headed by a matriarch, and then her daughters live in all the rooms. And in that society, men are not allowed to own property or even live in the house. They have to sleep in the courtyard. The only way that a man in that matriarchal society can have any sort of shelter is that they have to be taken in by the daughters of another family. So basically, in this world, women run everything, women are in charge of everything, and men have one purpose, which is to do manual labor and to have sex. Not the worst thing either, but one thing that's interesting there, and also in what I noticed in One Taste, in the matriarchal cult that I was in, this kind of society makes men docile. Like, in a patriarchal society, one of the aspects of it is that the male impetus is to control the unknown. So part of that is controlling sexuality, because sex creates chaos, controlling women, oppressing women. All those things have happened in our conventional society. But then by doing that, by controlling sex, controlling women, and oppressing women, female sex becomes a scarce resource. So obviously, in a marketplace, if something is a scarce resource, people are now going to compete for that and do crazy things to achieve that. And we can argue that the reason why we have skyscrapers and cell phones and all these sorts of achievements is that guys were trying to get laid. Might be a bit hyperbolic to say that, but I think, progress, a lot of our impulses are to procreate, right? So in the matriarchy, however, I noticed that it flipped the power dynamics. So women were no longer oppressed. Women were very free to express their sexuality. And what was interesting and ironic is that it flipped the supply and demand in the sexual marketplace. So suddenly male sexuality in this matriarchy became more valuable. And most men in this place, they no longer were seeing female sexuality as a scarce resource, because it's always kind of being offered. So in one way, in ironic way, it kind of empowered men in a way, but also as far as behavior went, it made men really docile. And I noticed myself, I had gone through this period of chapter 3 restoration where I was feeling really nurtured and good, and I went back into toddler mode. And then chapter 4 is kind of the resurgence of my ego. It's wait a minute, I don't want to always be metaphorically on my back. And I started to notice how I was losing a lot of what I would call masculine virtues in this. I was kind of losing my edge. I was becoming very soft. If you've seen photos of me from back then, I grew my hair out long. I was I'm kind of becoming a woman. This is, it's great to get in touch with my feminine side, but this is getting a little too extreme. So I basically decided this is when I was going to start a men's group. And if you're in the Masculine Underground Facebook group, I've posted about this. I always recommend this to any guy who wants to become a coach, especially for men. Start a men's group. Make it free, make it inexpensive, and just get into the habit of holding space for guys as they work through their shit, because that was my education of becoming a coach. I spent many hours doing that, gave certain competences and knowledge in that regard. But what was interesting is that my cult mom, she took on the role. She went from being the good mother who was very nurturing to taking on the role of being the oppressive mother, or Medusa, where she did not want me to develop this group because it was kind of initially it was a threat to their ideas. They didn't want a bunch of men to get together and like maybe talk about how they didn't like how things went. And this is actually discussed directly in Neumann's book about how men who are battling their internal mother complexes have this urge to get together, and this is why you see fraternities in college, gangs in amongst teenage boys. It's like they're realizing like, hey, like we don't want to be under our mothers, or we don't want to be under our mother's thumb our whole lives. Like let's get together so we can like be strong enough to battle it. So this was like where we butt heads, and basically my cult mom dominated me in different ways, hold on, I just want to make sure I didn't jump. I'm talking on 3 levels, so I just want to make sure I didn't jump through anything. Okay, yeah. So I ended up butting heads with her, and in different ways. Like she basically emotionally castrated me, and this is the thing that gets seen in mythology. So we'll talk about one of the myths that I think are important, the Isis Osiris myth. Oh, okay. One more thing with this. So actually one of the roots of misogyny is that, and one of the arguments of Jung and Neumann is that most men have an inherent fear because, especially through our development as toddlers, women or the feminine have a monopoly over certain things we need. When we're an infant, our mother is the source of breast milk, like the oral circuit that Freud and Robert Anton Wilson and refer to is like that's like our main MO. Is like we want to drink from the teat. Like that's the only way we could survive. Later on, the maternal side of our upbringing, whether it's our literal mom or other women that give us that nurturing, are a source of nurturing, of emotional support. And then later on, as we become post-pubescent and become interested sexually in women, women then become a monopoly of sexuality. This idea that some other party has control over your fate because they monopolize these resources you want creates fear, creates resentment, and as Yoda says, fear turns to anger, anger turns to hate. That to me is like the root of, I mean, any sort of class level hatred, like racism or anything. There's some fear that other group has some sort of power over you. So that's why the masculine impulse was to control anything of the feminine side of existence. So controlling nature was an obvious thing because Mother Nature, you know, the feminine term is in that. Mother Nature would spoil many of human intentions. Conquering women because women and sexuality kind of put men in this chaotic state. And you know, this is why basically one attempt of men to become immune to the control of women is to avoid them. So in modern day, we see this as MGTOW. These guys are like, oh, we don't need women because basically we're afraid of them. And in back in the day, in many religions, you would see this in the ascetic paths where clergy, for instance, would choose to be celibate. Why? Because if they are swearing that off, they never have to worry about the unknown chaos of being turned on or attracted to anything. All right, so return to childhood. Let's see, Sarah, battled movers. Okay, and yeah, and then one of So you know, last episode I spoke about the manic pixie dream girl as a kind of a one-dimensional archetype. Really, most archetypes are one-dimensional. I just want to reference that because, like, if you think of like the masculine archetype and some of the negatives it's created in society, that's like, if you think of it as a program and its one function is to overcome unknowns, that's kind of what spiraled out of control and became oppression of nature and women and the unconscious. But I was also just trying to reference that this by itself wasn't misogynistic. It's just the function of one-dimensional characters. Like even in The Lion King, Timon and Pumbaa were basically one-dimensional characters. They had a specific function to teach Simba Hakuna Matata. Rafiki was a one-dimensional character in a sense that he was just an old man. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl is also a one-dimensional character. In some ways, these patriarchal impulses also one-dimensional in that they are programs. They are not fully developed characters. Okay, so one of the reasons why, or one of the explanations for Neumann's thesis that men have this fear of women and this desire to control the unknown, is that the ego is the masculine side of the consciousness. So this is something you see across many different spiritual traditions. If you have read anything by Carlos Castaneda, who's this Toltec mystic, he's written a bunch of books that you may have seen in bookstores. He speaks about this in a lot of his books, that this is mystical language, of course, but most of the universe is feminine energy. Like masculine energy is kind of a newer thing on the scene, and we can see this, perhaps this is a metaphor or maybe literal, in that if you look at asexual creatures, asexuals, even single-celled organisms, and their later descendants who are sexual organisms, the female sexual organism and the asexual organism are very similar and almost identical, whereas the male version is kind of this new type, right? Like if you think of like humans, we have or many animals, we have the XY chromosome. If you know anything, not that I'm an armchair biologist as well, but the Y chromosome is incomplete, whereas XX is what females have. Anyway, the point is that maleness is the newer thing in terms of being on the scene biologically, but also psychically. The ego is seen as like the masculine side of the consciousness. Prior to the development of ego, prior to this separation from nature, when we're back in the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, that's basically like being just part of nature and like being part of the feminine. So a lot of the symbology of the Great Mother is you're basically like human consciousness is basically fighting against Mother Nature, the great unconscious, which is again why patriarchal impulses were to control women, control the unconscious, and control nature. All right, so I want to bring this back to the individual experience, because this is a part of the hero's journey that I see a lot of guys get stuck on, and I might sound a little judgmental, but this is the truth, and this is what I would say to a client or anybody who spoke to me one-on-one, is you see a lot of guys, especially, again, millennial dudes, or I want to just call out my generation. I think this is true for many people, where they will be really drawn to the hero's journey in fiction. Like, I think there's a reason why Marvel movies are so ridiculously popular right now, even though they all follow exactly the same structure, to the point of, I mean, there's a reason why we get so turned on or interested by these hero's journey stories, because I think most people, and this is true throughout history, most people don't leave the status quo, they don't do the thing they want, and here's the judgmental thing that I'll say to you if you're watching this: if there is something that you feel like this urge in your soul to do, whether it's physically do with your body or travel or talk to someone or say the truth that you want to say or express, whatever the thing is that you want to do, if you're not doing it, then you're denying your own hero's journey and you're denying your opportunity to become a hero. Because what a hero is psychologically is, and Neumann says this in throughout the book, and this is the idea of the hero. A hero is a creative individual who leaves the status quo. If you recall the hero's journey, the call to adventure is where he leaves the normal reality. So if you are stuck in normal reality, whether physically you're not going to leave your hometown or leave your group of friends or leave like your safe job, and enter the unknowns, then you are not letting yourself become an individual creative hero. You're just going to be part of the collective or part of the Ouroboros who has, when you're inside, you have no discrete identity. And the whole, again, with men, especially younger men, I think this attachment to mother or the mother archetype is where a lot of guys get stuck. So, and the effect of this is creative impotence, some maybe literal impotence. I think my psychogenic sexual dysfunctions stem from this as well, but also finding ease with women, because just to reference my experience for a second, the big difference that happened, the way that I knew something had changed in me was not necessarily that my dating life changed outwardly. It did a little bit, but it was more like when I interacted with women or interacted with anything of the feminine aspect of life, I no longer felt this contention or level of effort. Like, things became easeful because now I can connect as a peer. Because the whole idea behind a lot of these mythologies, I'm gonna break down the Isis with Osirus myth in a second. It's like the proto-hero. He's not quite a hero yet. He comes to confront the mother, usually in the form, and the mother usually will turn into the terrible mother, because that maternal archetype is basically like a psychological shit test. It's like she is challenging the proto-hero to see if he can rise up to be her peer, and if he fails, she emotionally castrates him. Or in a lot of the myths, the proto-hero literally gets his balls chopped off and he goes back into forever being a child. Or he rises up, he challenges the mother. Often, like in Perseus and Medusa, he literally cuts off the head of the mother, and the terrible mother is replaced by the good mother, who now can see him as a peer, and Athena bestows powers on Perseus because Athena is the good mother who loves him. And I think this happens a lot with guys, and guys I coach, and I say for myself, like, it's not that you have to fight your literal mom in order to be a guy, but if you are being oppressed by your mother or any maternal archetype in other people, I mean, for me it was my cult mentor who took that role, not my literal mom. When you challenge her, she's not gonna it's not like you have to literally kill her. It's that you have to be willing to disappoint her and disappoint her expectations to her, so that part of her that domineers over you or is enmeshing or is being the overbearing neurotic mom, that part of her, that archetype within her has to die, whether it's your literal mom or someone else. That part of her has to die so that she can relate to you as a peer. Which is why in mythology you see so much incest. We're going to get into that because for a long time I was like, why is it that in Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology people are always sleeping with their parents and brothers and sisters are getting together? Like, what is this? Like, was this something that people did back then? Probably not. I'm going to get into that now. So, the myth of Isis and Osiris. It's Egyptian myth. But first, I'm going to catch my breath and take a sip of water. All right, so the Egyptian myth of Isis, Osiris. Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys were two gods and two goddesses. They're all siblings. They're in the womb together, so they were quadruplets. When they were born, they paired off into brother, sister, wife pairings. Isis and Osiris got together, and Set and Nephthys got together. And basically, symbolically, this is supposed to be the union of light masculine feminine and the union of dark masculine feminine. If you know the story, or if you don't know the story, I'm going to tell you. Set, who's like the dark masculine in this form, kills Osiris, who's the light masculine. He's dead. His light feminine wife, Isis, mourns over him. Here's one of the weird things in the story. She takes his dismembered penis and impregnates herself and creates Horus, who is the sun god. And then throughout this time, Isis is there's side stories where Isis is lobbying to the Egyptian pantheon for Horus to be seen as a god. It's like she's being in a sense the overbearing mother of she's not letting him grow up. She's lobbying to the gods for him. He's stuck in child mode. At some point he does grow up, and then he wants to avenge his father. He wants to avenge Osiris, so he challenges Set, who is not only his father's killer, but is also his uncle, also his mother's sister, and his mother's brother and his father's brother, because it's all mixed up, right? And he goes on to fight. He challenges Set to a fight. In that battle between her son and her brother, Isis, the light feminine, actually has a change of heart. So she's the mother figure, right? She's the great mother here. She has a change of heart, and she actually feels bad. She actually sides with her brother in a strange turn of events. She sides with her brother, and not only does Horus, the son, now have to kill his uncle, he actually beheads his own mother because she sided with his uncle. All of this is symbolic, right? We'll get into it in a second. So Horus beheads her, but she doesn't die because she's a goddess, of course. He chops off her head and is replaced with a cow's head, and then she becomes the good mother. According to Neumann, the cow represents nourishment because we get milk from cows, and basically by killing the evil mother, she becomes the good mother. Reason why there's so much incest in mythology, in my opinion, but I think there's the opinion of many others as well, is that, of course, these are archetypes, right? They're not meant to represent actual characters, but we're characterizing them. So, for instance, we'll get into Oedipus in a second. There's experiences where, according to Neumann, the mother archetype and many archetypes are transpersonal, meaning that they're not actually the mother archetype isn't necessarily represented by your mom. Although when you're trying to characterize the mother archetype, of course you're going to think of a woman. If you're going to have a dream that represented the maternal archetype of nature, it would make sense that it would be represented in a dream by your literal mom or your grandma or your female boss or someone who takes that role. So in mythology or dreams, the idea is the son, in order to grow up, has to relate to the feminine in a different way. This feminine mother, let's say in this myth, is represented by Isis, a single character. He grows up, and really what he's doing is now, instead of relating to the feminine as son, so mother-son, he's relating to the feminine as a lover, so they're peers. But in the mythologies, it's still represented by the same character, because in the male psyche or the human psyche, this maternal archetype or this feminine archetype is like a transpersonal thing. It's not one person, right? So which is why you often see in mythologies sons going on to sleep with their mothers. It's really like a boy learning to become a man and relate to the feminine as a peer. You see this in dating with guys with mother complexes, where they, we call it the Madonna whore complex. Like, they're still attached to their mom, so when they go out and connect with women, it's hard for them to see them both as like this beautiful mother goddess and someone sexual. So a guy with a mother complex will typically have many meaningless sexual relations because he's still in love with his mom. He's still attached to his mom, so he can't switch over and relate to a good woman as a peer. He can only relate to her as a whore because he's still hung up on his mom. Jung goes into this of like women who are enmeshing, like mothers who are enmeshing because they fear the masculine themselves, will often subconsciously encourage this. And when you see this actually, this is a bit of a jump, but you see this in the movies a lot, where you see a guy who's clearly got an issue with the feminine. You saw this in the Joker movie with Joaquin Phoenix. There's an old movie called White Heat with James Cagney, where he's basically a cutthroat killer, like, but he's like madly in love with his mother. Like he's like he's like an Al Capone, even badder than Al Capone, like super cutthroat gangster. I think the movie's from the 40s or something, and but he's like madly in love with his aging mother. He kills all these people. He sleeps with all these women. But the whole time he's like kind of hung up on his mom. You see this in the Joker movie too. Like it's basically a movie on the development of a serial killer, very obsessed with his mother because he can't relate to the feminine outside of being a child. And so actually, this is important. Neumann wrote about this. He wrote this book, I think, in the 40s as well. I think the book came out in 1949. He was talking about how men who have mother complexes are very driven to suicide. So in the mythologies, a lot of times, as I mentioned with the castration stuff, the proto-hero will go on to challenge the great mother, and if he fails, he gets his nuts chopped off. Neumann was kind of predicting like a male suicide epidemic back in the 40s of like guys who have mother complexes. Like they just can never access their own individuality, so they're prone to suicide, they're prone to depression, they're prone to grandiose ideas, and then depression again. And a lot of men with mother complexes go on to kill themselves, to become like hopeless romantics or violent romantics that kill themselves. The way Neumann describes this experience, obviously there's a male suicide, I don't know if I call it an epidemic or unfortunate upward trend in modern society. The way that Neumann describes that experience in the book back in the 40s is it very much matches a lot of the male suicide killers that we see in the school shootings of modern days. Obviously he didn't predict that, but he did basically predict that kind of experience amongst disenfranchised young men who are still stuck in some level of adolescence. So one, I'm going to go into the Oedipus complex. This might be our last idea before I go into practical applications of this, if you recognize that you have some level of a mother complex. Neumann makes a distinction between lower masculinity and higher masculinity, and this matches up with Robert Anton Wilson and Freud's two different developmental circuits. So like when we're an infant, we're in that oral biosurvival circuit. Like the most important thing is getting nourishment from our mother's breast, and we're like basically unarmored in Reich terms. Like our bodies are soft, our minds are soft, and we're very much kind of an extension of our mother's body. The next level, which you see in the terrible twos in young children, is that they develop the anal emotional territorial circuit, which is, as any person with children, if you've ever seen 2-year-olds, like they start to say no, they start to develop their individuality, and this is more mapped to the paternal or masculine side of the psyche, where they're now seeing the world as like they're recognizing danger in the world, and they're seeing how they can deal with it directly. So people who I'm not going to talk. This is maybe a subject of the next episode, but this is where the father complexes come in, where someone feels like it's like always them against the world, as opposed to someone with a mother complex where it's like mommy and me against the world, or mommy's going to come in and protect me, which is the underlying assumption. So lower and higher masculinity. The lower masculinity is that oral biosurvival circuit where you're an infant attached to mom. The higher masculinity is where you develop your individuality and really the development of ego, where you're starting to see yourself as separate, and that maps to paternal things. And in the mythologies, he says that lower masculinity is associated with sexuality. So like when the proto-hero attempts to develop his individuation but fails, he gets castrated. He becomes impotent. Someone who feels, who maybe, I think this might be the root of many psychogenic sexual dysfunctions, because I think according to ads I see on Facebook, 1 in 5 millennials have some sort of psychogenic sexual issue. This is, I think, a disconnection from that lower masculinity, that earthy level where they came up against the great mother within their mind, and they failed, so now they're psychically impotent. The higher masculinity in mythology, which is more associated with like the intellect and the ego and seeing the world in terms of semantics and time, that's represented in mythology by sight. So here we're going to talk about the Oedipus Complex, another one of these incestual myths that I think get misunderstood. So let me just make sure I didn't miss anything from that last bit. So like the oral biosurvival circuit is when you're still attached to the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. You're not separate. And if you look at the brain, that's where we're still being run by the limbic system, the emotional brain. So we haven't really noted separation yet. Whereas when you move on to the emotional territorial circuit, the development of masculinity, you've overcome the first challenge from the great mother. You're not castrated. You go into that next level of emotional territorial. This is one thing on the suicide thing. Neumann said that in a lot of the cults, a lot of the matriarchal cults of antiquities, like the time of the ancient Egyptian empire, let's say, there were a lot of matriarchal cults that, like, let's say, worshipped some sort of goddess, and a lot of them were like orgies and stuff were common in these types of. They were kind of like the Dionysian cults, where like instead of controlling sexuality or controlling the unknown, they like were diving into the unknown. They're diving into mass hysteria, and within that mass hysteria, if a male individual, if a man didn't develop his serenity, it was kind of like him throwing himself against the challenge of the great mother. He would say like a lot of these guys would end up killing themselves as part of like there were actually mass suicides in some of these cults of guys who perhaps got lost in the sauce of the feminine. So on a much lighter note, if you look at modern times, you'll see this in younger guys a lot, where this is actually the whole thing behind the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. He starts to relate with like the extreme feminine. A Manic Pixie Dream Girl is a one-dimensional character that represents in many ways the dark feminine, also the light feminine, kind of extreme emotionality. If he gets lost, he gets driven mad, he gets lost in the sauce, he maybe ends up killing himself. Not in a dating situation, but in you'll see this in a guy who's like basically gone mad. Like he's in the pickup world, they call this one-itis. Like he's become head over heels for someone who's so not good for him because he could not stay grounded in the in response to the feminine. So she basically took his balls in metaphoric terms. One more thing on the lower masculinity side. I've read this a lot in many different places, in Neumann and Jung. Violent fantasies are a thing. So like this is actually what ties, I think, the suicide and the hysteria trends with what they didn't, what Jung and Neumann didn't foresee, which is the mass shootings we have in the Western world these days, which is violent fantasies are an attempt of the unconscious to separate from the mother complex. They're an unconscious attempt, right? So the young man who's feeling oppressed by the feminine, or maybe literally oppressed by his mother, is doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to create his own separation. So unconsciously he starts to think about violent things, or unconsciously he goes deep into his head. Why? Because violence is one area of the human experience that the feminine doesn't go. Right? Violence is very much a testosterone-driven thing. So when you see guys who are basically like impotent in their lives, or creatively impotent, or maybe literally impotent, very often they'll think, I mean, we have this in some of our colloquialisms, like a guy who's constantly on edge or constantly trying to fight people, we'll accuse him of having a little dick, or we'll accuse him of having sort of insecurity around his masculinity. He's trying to prove it all the time. He gets the big sports car to prove it. Not to say that that's always the case, but like these hyperbolic shows of masculinity are usually an attempt, or these hyperbolic fantasies, like killing a bad guy or starting a fight club, or to the extreme of like some sort of mass shooting atrocity. I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's a way. It's evidence of a mother complex. Let's put it that way. So guys, I've seen this in a lot of guys I coach, like guys who are feeling like they're not acting as a hero in their own lives. They'll fantasize about being an MMA fighter. They'll fantasize about being in a store and a guy breaks in and they save the day by punching him in the face. Like these are normal boyhood fantasies when you're trying to assert your masculinity. I would say to you, for anyone who is constantly like fantasizing about violence, chances are this is your unconscious trying to fight against your mother complex. Doesn't mean you need to actually get into a fight, although you might want an outlet in jiu-jitsu or something like that. Okay, higher masculinity, Oedipus is going to be the last thing before we go into practical tips and close the show here. So the Oedipus myth, what most people know about Oedipus is that he kills his father and marries his mother. Another one of these things, and another one of these insexual examples in mythology that you're like, wait, what's the deal with that? But as I mentioned, they're all representative of these transpersonal elements. So there's actually more to the Oedipus myth that I actually forgot until I reread it just recently. So Oedipus, he's born to a king and queen. The king hears from a soothsayer, your son is going to grow up to kill you, so you got to get rid of him. He has someone kill his son, but I think it was like a shepherd or somebody's. He didn't have the heart to kill the baby, so instead he nailed the baby's feet to a rock and was like, okay, nature will take care of them. Maybe the symbolism in Mother Nature not killing Oedipus, but whatever. Some shepherd saves him. The boy grows up, and he's called Oedipus because he has like a broken foot because his feet were nailed to the rock when he was a child. Oedipus grows up to fight the Sphinx. I actually forgot that the Sphinx tail and Oedipus were one. The Sphinx being a female lion with a woman's head, a lion's body with a woman's head. And the Sphinx gives him a riddle before he battles the Sphinx, which is what animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs at night? The answer was man. And I remember hearing this as a child, and I'm like, that's the lamest friggin' riddle. Like, oh yeah, I mean, we walk as a baby, and then we walk on 2 legs, and we walk with a cane. Like, it's not a very clever riddle. But actually, looking at all the symbolism, it actually is like trying to explain, it's trying to show the development of male consciousness again. So he passes the riddle, he kills the Sphinx. By killing the Sphinx, he becomes the hero. Like, he's overcome the lower masculinity challenge. Like, he's not castrated, he's virile, he's able to fight the physical demon through his brute strength of being a man and stuff. And then he goes on to come across his own father, who he doesn't know is his father, on the road. They get into a squabble. He kills his own father, not knowing it's his father. Goes on to the city where his mother is now a widow, doesn't know it's his mother, marries his mother, consummates the marriage with his mother, then later finds out that he just killed his father and married his mother. So what does he do with his shame? He blinds himself, because vision is the representative in most mythologies of that higher masculinity and intellect. Trying to connect this to another thing. A lot of human experience and our disconnection from nature, a lot of people say this is not an original idea of mine. Our disconnection from nature comes from that as humans we overuse 2 abilities that we have that other animals have, but we use them to an extreme, which is our sight and our opposable thumbs. Like dolphins are supposedly as smart as human beings, but they don't overuse their sight and opposable thumbs. If you look at the way the world we created, it's very sight based. So this is an example of like perhaps patriarchal or male-dominated development of society where we're overusing sight. So that's one of the connections between vision and this like so-called higher masculinity. Oedipus, basically, again, even though he overcame the lower masculinity challenge, he fails at the higher masculinity challenge through his shame. It's self-imposed, but this is perhaps you can say coming from the terrible mother, gouges out his own eyes and becomes blind. And one thing here again with the incest thing, because one of Jung's disagreements with Freud is the whole thing of the Oedipus complex of like every boy wants to secretly sleep with their mother. According to Jung, a lot of the Jungian psychologists make fun of Freud of like seeing this myth as too literal, or seeing these impulses as too literal. I mean, if you have a dream of having sex with your mom, it doesn't mean you actually want to do that. It could be representative of this kind of thing where you're trying to become peers to the feminine as opposed to being a child to the feminine. It just so happens that to your unconscious, and we see this in mythology, they don't always switch out the characters, right? Like the feminine might be represented by your mother, and as you develop into a man who can be a father, your unconscious might still show it as your mother, because that's the placeholder it's happened to use. And you see this in many myths of the son, father, son thing, where a son, and you see this even in the Horus, Isis, Osirus myth, the son grows up to have sex with his mother, and she has a child, which is himself. Doesn't make sense on a literal level, but if you look at the metaphors, it's like you're recreating, you're no longer becoming a child, you're becoming a peer, and interacting with the feminine sexually rather than as a child, because you're becoming a man. So like, I mean, I don't have children obviously, but one of the I guess symptoms or tells of a guy who's in a mother complex is that he wants to keep behaving as a child. And like, not to say that people should have children or anything like that, but like a grown man who is unable to take responsibility for another being, in my opinion, is not fully formed. It's not to say that you need to, have a family or lead a team or have children or be in charge of anything, but this is actually a primary function. To go back all the way to the beginning to the anthropological stuff of why we have sexual dimorphism, why there are testosterone-driven traits and physical features and behaviors versus oxytocin-driven traits, there is a function, there are various functions of the masculine archetype, various functions of masculinity. It's not just lifting heavy objects, it's not just fighting and competing, it's also the vision and being the head of something. And not to say, being the head not necessarily of like telling people what to do, it's about having the vision for the group and taking responsibility for the group. One of, I think, the terrible byproducts of a patriarchal culture is that people overvalue leadership, and to the point where they think, or not, I shouldn't say that like that. People think that being a leader is always better than being a follower. In a matriarchal society, you wouldn't see that. And actually, I only have one example, or two examples, the Mogo tribe and Sex at Dawn, and then my own matriarchal cult experience. Most people actually don't want to be leaders. It's a lot of responsibility to leaders, a lot of work to be a leader. It's actually a lot easier and a lot more fun in many ways to entrust your well-being to someone else, to a parental figure, or the leader of your team, or a leader of your group, or a leader of your nation. Is why we have presidents and prime ministers. It's a lot easier on the mind to not have to take responsibility for everything, instead entrust the big decision to someone else, and to just take care of like a smaller piece. Like, that's kind of a gift of the masculine or the father nature. So on a developmental level, whether you choose to have children or lead a team or not, if you're not striving at least, or in a place where you are able to take responsibility for something beyond yourself, I think you're doing yourself a disservice, but also doing society and anyone you relate to a disservice. Like, I would see this a lot in, I think the mother complex is rampant in the pickup community. A lot of guys who I, entered this whole exploration with, maybe they've gone very far with pickup, they've slept with all these women, they've had all these adventures, but but they're still at one. There's a couple things you see in these guys, or I see in these guys, that I'm critical of. One is that no matter how many experiences they've had with women, they still feel at its mercy. Like, you see some like these pickup guys, I tease them on this, like, they may have slept with hundreds of women, but as soon as a woman walks into the room, they kind of they change their behavior. Like, it's like they have to go into like striving mode. This is level of effort, as opposed to this level of ease, which comes when you actually see yourself as a peer to women or the feminine. You no longer get like flustered just because there's someone who may, like, you don't see women as this monopoly of your well-being anymore. You don't see as sex or nurturing as this thing that has to come because someone in a mother complex is still seeing the feminine as their mother rather as their peer or lover. Anyway, I went on a little rant there. Do you have anything else on that rant? Being able to take responsibility for things beyond yourself, because the other feature of guys stuck in the mother complex I see a lot in the dating coaching world is that they're still very hung up on their individual problems. I think this is you could call it a spiritual thing. If you are, I think it's important at some point to be selfish. And all of this stuff that we're talking about, this stage of the hero's journey, is the birth of ego. It's not the end of the hero's journey. It's just the beginning. It's where you separate from the Ouroboros, you separate from the status quo, and you start to go through your own unconscious or go through the world through a transformational journey to find out who you really are. And that's important to be selfish in the beginning. Thanks, Tim, for the comment. Tim said, "Cool point." It's the beginning of the hero's journey. It's where you separate and define your own self, and it's really important in the beginning to have a selfish motivation. It's totally fine to have a selfish motivation. In fact, most of us, our call to adventure, whether it's a personal call to adventure, an internal call to adventure, or something you go out and do in the world, very often is for some selfish motivation. You start the business because you need money, or you start the business because you want to free yourself from your boring corporate job. You go after the woman because you want to be with the woman for selfish reasons. You think she's attractive, you want to have sex with her, you want to love her, you want to date her. Selfish motivation, it's fine. Whatever the thing is, right? Frodo leaves the Shire to go to Mordor, not because he really cares about the responsibility of the ring, but he just wants to have an adventure. That's totally fine. But at some point, when you get past the oral biosurvival circuit, when you actually leave the protection of the mother within your psyche, you have to get to the point where now other people's problems matter more. In a typical hero's journey, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, pick your obvious hero's journey story. At some point, the hero stops caring about himself. He's like, Luke Skywalker doesn't just care about his own mastery of the Force. He's like, oh shit, I need to use this to save the galaxy, or I need to use this to save the Shire, or whatever. And that's actually for the next stage where we'll talk about the father complex. But that's important, right? If you're still, if you're a grown man and you're only thinking about your own selfish problems, it's not wrong, because everyone has a different stage of their development. Just know that there's something bigger and better at the next stage, which, in my opinion, is dealing with the problems of other people. And that's actually where it gets more fun, because if I go back to, sorry, I'm speaking quickly because I'm excited. If I go back to my book, stage 3 is where I was being very selfish and just like, yes, give me spiritual advice, give me sexual experiences, give me nurturing. At a certain point, I noticed in myself, I was getting antsy because I was getting what we call diminishing returns on pleasure. So the birth of the Son of Swords archetype was my birth of ego, of like, oh, I need to deal with something bigger than myself, and that's when I started a men's group. And that's, I don't think it's necessarily a split between selfishness and altruism. Like when I started that men's group, I was doing it because it felt good to me, right? Like things are on point and things are correct within your hero's journey or resonant with your hero's journey when the thing that feels good to you also happens to benefit other people. Like you're not doing it because you want to be seen as moral or good or just. You're doing it because it actually just feels good to serve people, which I think is natural when you have fixed your own inadequacies or gotten out of your own perceptions with scarcity. It's like, well, what do I do with all of this stuff? What do I do with this extra money that I don't need necessarily? What do I do with this extra love or extra awareness or emotional security that I don't need for myself? Well, I can somehow help other people, or take on a cause of some sort. Okay, so we're gonna close this out now with. And I did want to mention, all right, one last thing before we close it out. I didn't actually talk about the Son of Swords archetype. I'm squeezing this in because I forgot to. Throughout my book, a lot of it is me confronting my inner feminine, confronting my experiences with women, but also like some of the mystical stuff, which I'd also call the feminine side of healing. Throughout the book, I go in as a hyper-rational guy, right? I was like super in my head, super judgmental of anything, of many things that are mystical. I shouldn't say anything, but coincidentally or synchronistically or just very perfectly, throughout the story of my cult experience, it's a true story, but I did connect with a real woman who was very much a manic pixie dream girl to me. Like she had more depth to her than just the manic pixie side of her, but in the way she related to me, she really showed that manic pixie archetype where like she did all these irrational things that would fluster me but also challenge me to grow. One of those things was that she was constantly referring to astrology. So in the first couple chapters of the book, I'm constantly rolling my eyes at her when she pulls out the fool archetype or pulls out this archetype and says, well, this is exactly what's going on because this card came out. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Kind of synchronistically, throughout the chapter, she'll pull a card that in some way relates. And I'm using some literary, what's it called? Poetic license there, but actually during this period where I was confronting the great mother within my cult and confronting the terrible mother and trying to not get emotionally castrated, she pulled a card for me that was within this deck. It's called the Son of Swords. There's a specific tarot card deck, which I only learned later. It's round cards instead of square cards. It's a very feminine-centric deck, which was kind of perfect. That was in the Matriarchy. And all the cards are related to the feminine experience as opposed to the masculine hero's journey. And so the card that I pulled was one of the few male characters within the entire deck. Almost all the cards. It has many of the typical cards you have in all decks, like the Fool archetype, the Magician, whatever. They had very few cards that were actually boys. A lot of the Magician was a female, the Fool was a female, all of that stuff. But one of the cards that was male was the Son of Swords, and you see like this Viking, this like gladiator guy. He's got a sword. He looks really badass. And she pulled the card, and I was like, "Oh, cool! Like that seems like a badass card. I don't know what it means, but it looks cool." And she's like, "No, this is a terrible card. This is a card of like," and she showed me like what the book said about it. It's like the overcompensation of male rationality in response to the mother. I kind of like just shrugged at it, but I look back at now at like when she pulled this card for me and the experiences I had confronting the tyrannical mother within my cult, and it was just oddly perfect. Like, so the Son of Swords is a developmental stage, in my opinion, that isn't pleasant. I think it's what most of us should go through when we're 13, 14, and many of us do, but I think a lot of us don't complete that cycle where we still feel rebellious. It's like the rebellion of the masculine ego of like, hey, we don't necessarily need to be under mother's wing anymore, and then like, they become an arrogant teenager, which is what is typical of teenagers. But I would call out certainly the MGTOW communities and much of the red pill community where they're basically acting like a 14-year-old kid who's like, no girls allowed, we don't need girls, like they're oppressive, girls are mean. That's basically the underlying assumption of a lot of their advice, or a lot of underlying vibe of a lot of their advice. And it's not necessarily, although I do think it's a developmental stage where the male psyche develops his individuality, comes up against challenges, or like, the universal shit tests of the female aspect of the psyche, doesn't get castrated, and becomes the hero of his own journey. But it's not where you stop, because you do want to reintegrate your ego and not just be a head on a stick who's trying to control nature and oppress women necessarily. Or you probably don't want that, it's just not fun. Okay. So bringing this in to... all right, just to end the cult side of the story, that's the third layer. What happened was I ran the men's group by standing up to my terrible mother archetype who was trying to oppress me and say, you're not good enough, you can't. I started it I just did it was kind of like one of these covert tests where I just did what I wanted, and through that, through not folding to her challenge, she started to respect me, and from there they actually, because of that, in many ways, they moved me into a leadership position, and I rose in the ranks very quickly. And basically my cult mentor, who was trying to oppress me and oppressed a lot of men as the terrible mother, went on to become my good mother. And call her my cult mom. She's a real person in real life, and she's done many negative things, many things that very much embody the dark feminine, manipulation, all sorts of like things that she's done to people that have been bad. At the same time, she was also, hands down, if she happens to listen to this, I want you to hear this. Hands down, the greatest teacher I've ever had. Through interacting with her, and despite interacting with her, I learned some of the most profound lessons of my life and accessed parts of myself that I don't know how I would have accessed otherwise. Like things that I'm very grateful in myself of, what I would call virtuous aspects of my personality, or things that I really like, came from interacting with her. So even though she tried to emotionally castrate me and maybe emotionally blind me at certain times, actually throughout the story she does a lot of underhanded things to me, but even worse things to other people. She definitely represents the dark feminine. I learned so much, and I'm saying this all because as we bring this on to the practical application of what to do about your own mother archetype, the growth here doesn't come from shaming or attacking the dark feminine. It comes from confronting it, taking the ultimate shit test from them, and making sure you stand in your potency so you don't get castrated, and maintain your vision so you don't get emotionally blinded, which is what we see a lot in guys. So to practical things, what to actually do with it. A client was like, okay, this is great, I understand I have a mother complex. What do I actually do with all this? I gave him a couple suggestions, and I offer you these suggestions. One being, if you look at it from a hero's journey perspective, you have to separate from your environment. When the ego was born in humanity, in human development, part of that separation from nature, which we may see as the leaving of the Garden of Eden, the fall from grace, was entering the void on their own. I mean, the Genesis in the Bible is like a very patriarchal view of it, like we leave God. But if you look at pre-Christian or pre-Judaism mythologies, there's similar types of things where the human falls from grace and leaves the Ouroboros, or the protection of Mother Nature. Sorry, there's boats in the background, I don't know if you can hear them. But that's part of the hero's journey, of being willing to leave the safety of the Shire and enter the void, because entering the unknown is part of confronting the feminine, whether it's light or dark. It's is trusting in yourself as a solitary hero, as a sovereign consciousness, as an ego, to be like, okay, I can confront the unknown and uncontrollable things that I'm going to experience out in the great unknown, which in films, again, means leaving the Shire, leaving Tatooine, going on the adventures. But internally, and the reason why we're drawn to these stories is that it's confronting the things that are hidden in our unconscious. To bring this to example of the young man, or any man who wants to explore the world, for instance, or start his own business and leave corporate, but his friends, his status quo, all shame him. They all say like, "Oh, you're stupid." Like, "Oh, we're gonna start another business, be like an Instagram whore." Like, what's like, And they all challenge him. The whole crabs in a barrel, trying to drag him down. If he succumbs to that, that's the same emotional castration. Basically, he's like giving up his balls to stay another crab in the barrel, as opposed to having the balls of like, you know what? I don't care if everyone's shaming me. I don't care if my friends think this is crazy. I don't care if my parents think this is crazy. I'm okay with disappointing my parents, which is the metaphor of slaying the mother. I don't care if they think less of me or talk shit about me. I'm going to go out and face the great unknown on my own and see what happens and see what I'm made of, right? So literally, if you have a mother complex and you find yourself always following the status quo of whatever your parents tell you, or whatever your conventional tribe or the people you hang out with tell you to do, as opposed to following your heart, an obvious thing is to go out and follow your heart. I know in the time of coronavirus it's kind of hard to travel the world or do those things, but you can start a business right now, or maybe you can, maybe it's quitting your job. I know it's a cliche thing, but it's a very common thing for most people. Most people who have oppressive jobs want to quit their job, and they just don't have the balls to do it. This is your internal shit test from your own inner feminine. Do you have the balls to do the thing that is scary and unknown? The second thing, or one thing, the other thing is related to material accomplishment. I'm giving you three suggestions. First is to separate from your environment, especially if you think your peers or your environment, parental or friend, is dragging you down. It's an obvious thing. That's literally a start of the call to adventure, or crossing the threshold. The second thing I suggest is very low-hanging fruit, is to do some sort of a strength training. This is for men specifically, I think most people, but as we speak about in the Masculine Archetype Challenge, there are three pillars of uncovering the masculine archetype within yourself. Introspection, which we're doing. If you're watching this, I assume you're introspective. There is being grounded, which is being willing to take on the unknown. We spoke about that. The third thing is material accomplishment. The androgen receptors in your brain, the receptors in your brain that register testosterone and are affected by testosterone, respond to accomplishing challenges. There's something called the winner effect, which I've talked about a lot, but if you haven't heard, I'm going to briefly explain it again. Anytime you perceive that you have won a challenge, your testosterone levels spike and your dopamine levels spike in your bloodstream, but also your nervous system develops more receptors for testosterone and dopamine. This is a huge thing. You're literally changing your chemistry by taking on challenges and winning. There's also something called the loser effect, where if you take on a challenge and fail, it actually reduces your receptors. And you can see why this happens, right? Sorry, I'm losing my papers. 1 second. Testosterone and dopamine. If you win something, it feels good to have that testosterone and dopamine surge. So obviously your brain is going to create more receptors so you can have a greater boost of pleasure and well-being from doing that. Whereas if you lose something, if you fail a challenge, your body doesn't want you to feel that depression, so it'll reduce the number of receptors. And like you'll see this in people who grow up kind of effeminate and they don't have that competitive edge. You can maybe make an educated guess that they actually literally in their bodies have less androgen receptors in their nervous system. That's why they don't care about winning and losing. Not to say that you should overly care, because you can see on the other extreme someone who's way too competitive probably has way too many androgen receptors, because obviously that, it's testosterone driven impulses are not always good. They're not absolutely good. In fact, most of my knowledge about testosterone comes from the book The Virility Paradox. You can check out my podcast with the author Charles Ryan. I think it's episode 32 or something like that. And his whole book is called The Virility Paradox because testosterone and virility is a paradox. It's not all good. There's many negatives from having too much testosterone, but you can listen to his book or read his book if you want to know about that. But back to the second suggestion I have, strength training, like heavy resistance training, is one of the lowest hanging fruits to, one, give your sense of material accomplishment and increase your testosterone and androgen receptors, which I don't think it gets spoken about enough for men. It's a huge part of well-being, and all of this introspective stuff is very good and important. And feeling your feelings, all that's important. But if you are feeling crappy, if you are prone to depression, if you're kind of lost and you're not exercising, you're just missing out on one of the easiest ways to improve your mood and well-being and sense of everything. Like anytime I've been lost in my life and didn't know what to do, I just picked a fitness goal. I became obsessive about it, and through that, my creative inspiration woke up again. And it could have been because I was redeveloping those androgen receptors and feeling virile and vital in my body, or it could be a little more abstract than that. It doesn't matter. Strength training, because when you do things, when you do I've gotten really into kettlebells. Actually, this week I'm speaking to Brett Jones, the head instructor of Strong First, which is Pavel Sausulin's company, who he'll be on the podcast soon. So if you listen to the podcast, if you're not subscribed, you want to learn some fitness tips, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and you can hear them from him, because I'm not quite a fitness expert myself. But anytime you're doing heavy resistance training and developing your body in that way, or doing martial arts and developing your body in that way for being able to fight, not to say that that's the point of it, it's really hard to see yourself as a child, and a lot of those boyhood or son-like impulses will probably reduce. Not to say that there aren't meatheads with mother complexes, but it's low-hanging fruit. And the final suggestion, the final practical tip I would give to someone who wants to confront or overcome what might be a mother complex or residue or mother complex-like behaviors is to find a way to engage with the feminine as a peer. And if you have any sort of mother complex behaviors with your literal mom, or a maternal figure in your life, maybe a female boss, or could even be an older sister, or maybe, unfortunately, I think a lot of guys have mother complex relationships with their wives or girlfriends, which is unfortunate. To re-engage with the feminine, or whatever person really represents the maternal archetype in you, re-engage with that person as a peer. This is actually a suggestion I got from my girlfriend, because despite a lot of my steps forward with shifting my relationship and fears with the feminine within myself and externally, my mom's a great person, very enmeshing, very neurotic, and even up until recently, I noticed she would still look at me or talk to me like I'm a little kid, even though I'm 32 now. And I got a suggestion from my girlfriend, which is to take my mom out for lunch. It seems like a simple gesture, but it's really hard for someone to see you as a child when you're buying them lunch. It's just kind of like the archetypal switch you can do with a lot of people. And anytime you see yourself relating to someone and you're both expressing archetypes in a way that you don't like child parent or bullied or something like that, one way to shift that is to do something do an action that is not resonant with
that kind of archetypal connection. So I bought my mom lunch, and it was actually a very profound thing where something shifted in my mom, and she started to speak to me as if I was a peer because I was buying her lunch. Like, she can't look at me as a boy if that's the case. So it might seem quite simple, but a lot of these mundane actions can have profound effects in how you relate to those parts of yourselves. I mean, if you look at the myths, like, we're not taking the myths literally, but they all represent things that can, like, very often have profound, or they can map to profound things in our consciousness. So this was abstract, or it was a very deep topic. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I get excited when we're talking about stuff like this, and, you know, speaking on 3 levels. So we're talking about, this was the mother complex, and flushing that out. I don't know if it's going to be next week or in 2 weeks. I'm going to do one on the father complex. So, like, we've covered leaving the oral biosurvival circuit and shifting over to becoming a sovereign ego, but that's not the end of the hero's journey. The next level is to confront the father, and this is seen in slaying the primary father and seeking the secondary father, which is your mentor, which we see in Obi-Wan and Yoda and Gandalf, which is, I would say, the next level of the hero's journey when it comes to the masculine psyche. So we'll do that probably in 1 or 2 weeks. If it's not next week we're going to talk about a book that was recommended to me by my buddy Maris, called The Man Who Taps the Secrets of the Universe. It's more than a mindset book. There was actually a really interesting idea called the Life Triumphant, which they throw in that book, and I think it's something that is not only interesting for a developmental perspective, but given that many of us are quarantined or on lockdown or not able to do a lot of things, and, like, there's not a lot to do other than obviously waste your time on the internet or sit and be introspective. It's something that I think I just read this book last week, so it's kind of a new idea to me, but I think it's a very interesting perspective on what to do with your time, especially in this time of the coronavirus. So that's that. If you want to know more about what's going on for me, you can check out the Love in the Time of Coronavirus series that my girlfriend and I are doing. You can look her up at Brittany Bond, or you can subscribe to her on YouTube. This Remote Collective on YouTube. There should be a playlist called Love in the Time of Coronavirus. You will see my face in it because it's us talking about our unusual relationship situation in these unusual times. And yes, it's a reference to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. Final announcements at the archetype class. I've reinstated the free coaching session that comes with the archetype class. Obviously, I'm plugging myself, but I also think this is a great time to be introspective. And if you wanted to do these courses, my other course is also available at a discount if you join the archetype class. If you wanted to do these courses, if you want to develop these parts of yourselves, but because of work, because of all the things you have to do, you just didn't have the time, now is a great time. I mean, I'm signing up for masterclass. It's like it's a great time to read all the books you wanted to read and study all the things you wanted to study, because what else is there to do, right? So you can access that at ruwando.com/archetype. I'm offering the free coaching session to everyone who signs up right now, because I want to be there for you, because this is a great time to develop this stuff. And if you happen to have mother complex or notice you have mother complex behaviors, the best way, I would love to work it out with you. Sign up for the archetype class and we'll schedule a one-on-one call and we can dig into this stuff, because even more than talking about this mythology and the hero's journey and talking about my own experiences, even more than that I enjoy is working on the hero's journey sections with other people. I love, it's my favorite thing in the whole world is to work out someone's life story with them and basically witness someone's life story and help someone move to the next chapter, because it's just entertaining. Forget about everything else. It's just really fun. Some people watch Marvel movies. I watch people's real lives. It's a personal choice. So that's at ruwando.com/archetype. You could sign up for that, and I would love to have a conversation with you while we're all on lockdown. I think that's it. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to drop them. I will catch them eventually, and next week tune in to the next episode.